I was sprawled across the couch, half watching some detective show with Dad when the screen cut to black. The well-known blue background of an emergency alert appeared, but something felt off immediately. Instead of the usual crisp, professional announcer, the voice that came through our speakers was wrong, garbled and choppy like someone speaking through water. "This is an emergency broadcast system alert. Please remain indoors," and the words dissolved into static, then picked up again mid-sentence. "Avoid contact with ZT. Authorities are investigating reports of..." I reached for the remote to turn up the volume, but Dad was already standing, running a hand through his hair. He started walking in a small circle around our coffee table, and I could see the muscles in his jaw working. "Dad? What's going on?" He didn't answer. The alert kept playing, but each time it looped, the voice became more distorted. What had started as professional and calm now sounded like it was being stretched and warped, the words sliding into each other until they barely made sense. "Remain in your homes until further grst. Unknown threat has been. Do not attempt to leave." Dad was pacing faster now, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. "What the hell is this?" The voice on the television was getting worse. Each repetition sounded less like human speech and more like something trying to imitate it. The words came out in wrong rhythms, stretched too long or clipped too short. I felt my skin crawl as I listened to it. "Dad, seriously, what's wrong?" I sat up straighter, pulling my legs under me. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He stopped pacing and looked at me, his blue eyes wide and unfocused. "I don't know. He shook his head hard. "Something's not right about this. This isn't how these things work." The alert had been going for maybe 3 minutes now, but it felt much longer. The voice had degraded to the point where I could barely pick out individual words anymore. It sounded like someone speaking backwards, or like audio being played at the wrong speed. The hair on my arms stood up as I listened to it. Then everything went dark. The television cut out completely, along with every light in the house. Even the digital clock on the cable box had gone black. I blinked hard, trying to adjust to the sudden darkness and look toward the windows. Our street was completely dark too. No street lights, no porch lights, no blue glow from other televisions. The whole neighborhood had gone black at exactly the same moment. "Power's out," I said, stating the obvious because the silence was making me nervous. Dad was walking through the darkness toward the kitchen. I heard him pulling open drawers, searching for something. A moment later, a beam of light showed up in the darkness as he flicked on a flashlight. "Here." He walked back over and pressed it into my hands. His fingers were shaking slightly as they brushed against mine. "I need you to go downstairs. To the basement." My stomach dropped. The basement was my least favorite place in our house, even with the lights on. "Why? What's happening?" "I need to check all the doors and windows. Make sure everything's locked up tight." He was already moving toward the front door, feeling along the wall for the deadbolt. "Just go downstairs and wait for me, okay? I'll be down in a few minutes." I got up slowly, shining the flashlight around our living room. Everything looked weird in the bright light. Our furniture made strange shapes. The walls looked further away than normal. "Dad, you're scaring me." He paused at the front door, his hand on the lock. "I know. I'm sorry. I just need to make sure we're secure, and I need you somewhere safe while I do it." The word "safe" sent a chill through me. Safe from what? But something in his voice told me this wasn't the time to argue. Dad wasn't the type to panic over nothing, and I'd never seen him look this upset. I pointed the flashlight toward the basement door and walked across the kitchen. The light showed normal stuff, our breakfast dishes still in the sink, Mom's coffee mug on the counter from this morning, the grocery list stuck to the fridge with a magnet. Everything normal and exactly where it should be. The basement door creaked as I opened it, and the smell of concrete and old cardboard came up from below. I pointed the flashlight down the wooden stairs, lighting up each step as I walked down. Behind me, I could hear Dad checking windows, the sound of latches turning and frames being tested. The basement felt colder than the rest of the house, and I pulled my sweatshirt sleeves down over my hands as I got to the bottom of the stairs. Our washer and dryer sat quiet in one corner, and cardboard boxes full of Christmas decorations and old photo albums lined the walls. I found a spot on the old couch Dad kept down here and sat down, keeping the flashlight pointed toward the stairs. From upstairs, I could hear him going through the house, room by room. The sound of his footsteps was kinda comforting, steady and on a mission, like he was following some kind of checklist in his head. But under that comfort was a growing knot of worry in my chest. Whatever had been wrong with that emergency alert, whatever had freaked Dad out so badly, was still out there in the dark. I sank back into the couch cushions and listened to him work his way through the house above me, the flashlight making a small, bright spot in the dark basement. I'd been sitting on the couch for maybe 10 minutes when Dad's footsteps changed. What had been methodical and reassuring before turned into something else entirely. Rapid, uneven steps that seemed to have no pattern or purpose. He was moving back and forth across the living room floor above me. The same area over and over again. The steady clicking of locks being checked had stopped. Instead, I could hear him muttering under his breath, though the words were too muffled to make out through the basement ceiling. I moved my position on the couch, trying to get closer to the source of the sound. The old springs creaked as I moved, and I winced, hoping he couldn't hear me down here. His voice was getting louder, not speaking to me, not calling down to check if I was okay, but talking to someone else, or something else. The problem was I hadn't heard another voice respond, and I definitely hadn't heard the phone ring. The power was still out. Even if someone had tried to call, our cordless phones wouldn't work without electricity. I pressed my ear against the ceiling, the cold concrete beam making me shiver. Dad's words were clearer now, but they still didn't make sense. He was arguing with someone, his voice sharp and defensive, like he was explaining himself or justifying something. But the pauses between his statements were wrong, too short for someone to actually be responding, too long for him to just be thinking. "No, that's not..." His voice cut through the ceiling, followed by heavy footsteps. "I told you, I checked everything, every window, every door." My stomach knotted up. Dad never talked to himself like this. He was the most practical person I knew, the one who stayed calm when Mom and I got worked up about things. But there was something in his tone now that made my hands shake as I held the flashlight. The pacing got faster. I could track his movement across the living room by following the sound, from the front window to the couch, back to the window, then toward the kitchen. But he wasn't walking normally anymore. The steps were heavier, more forceful, like he was stomping or trying to wear a path in the floor. Then the shouting started. "I said no!" Dad's voice boomed through the house so loud it made me jump. "I'm not doing that! Get away from me!" I scrambled off the couch and moved closer to the stairs. This wasn't like him at all. Dad raised his voice sometimes when he was frustrated with a project or when the neighbors were being too loud, but this was different. This was rage, pure and simple, and it was directed at someone I couldn't hear. Something heavy hit the floor upstairs. Furniture being moved, but not carefully. Dragged or shoved with enough force that I could feel the vibration through the ceiling. A chair maybe, or the coffee table. Then another crash, and the sound of something smaller falling over. "Dad?" I called up the stairs, but my voice came out weak and shaky. "Dad, are you okay up there?" No response. The yelling continued, but now I could barely make out individual words. His voice had taken on a quality I'd never heard before, rough and strained, like he'd been screaming for hours. But it had only been a few minutes since this started. My palms were already slick with sweat. The basement felt even colder now, and I pulled the sleeves of my sweatshirt down over my hands, trying to warm up. But the chill wasn't just from the temperature. It was coming from somewhere deeper, a feeling that something was seriously wrong with the person upstairs. More furniture moving, accompanied by what sounded like books or magazines being swept off shelves. Dad was tearing through the living room, and from the sound of it, he was making a complete mess. Mom was going to be furious when she got home and saw whatever damage he was doing. That thought made me pause. Mom. She was supposed to be out with her book club friends tonight, probably at some restaurant downtown, completely unaware that anything was wrong. She had no idea about the emergency alert or the power outage or whatever was happening to Dad right now. "Where are you?" Dad's voice shook the entire house. "I know you're here." I backed away from the stairs, my whole body shaking. That wasn't the voice of someone who was confused or upset. That was the voice of someone who was hunting something. Someone who was absolutely sure there was an intruder in our house and was checking room by room to find them. But I'd been down here the whole time. I would have heard if someone had broken in. The front door was still locked. I'd heard him checking it myself. And if there really was someone else in the house, why wasn't Dad calling the police? Why wasn't he calling down to warn me? The pacing above me had turned into stomping now, heavy boots against hardwood floors. Back and forth, back and forth. Every few seconds, another crash would break up the pattern as he knocked over lamps or picture frames or whatever else was in his way. I tried calling up to him again, louder this time. "Dad, what's going on up there? Should I call Mom?" Still nothing. Either he genuinely couldn't hear me over his own shouting, or he was ignoring me completely. Both possibilities scared me, but the second one scared me more. Dad always answered when I called to him, even when he was busy or stressed. The only time he ever ignored me was when he was trying to protect me from something. My hands were shaking so badly now that the flashlight beam kept bouncing around the basement walls, making everything look wrong. I sat back down on the couch and pulled my knees up to my chest, trying to make myself smaller, trying to hide in the cushions. The sounds overhead weren't getting any better. If anything, Dad's voice was becoming more distorted, more rough. The words were harder to pick out, like he was speaking with something stuck in his throat, and the anger in his tone was getting worse, not just mad anymore, but furious in a way that scared me. I'd never been afraid of my own father before. Not once. Not even when he was at his most frustrated or disappointed. But sitting in that basement, listening to him destroy our living room while screaming at invisible enemies, I realized I was terrified of whatever was happening upstairs. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone steady as I pulled it from my pocket. The screen's blue glow felt harsh in the basement darkness, and I had to squint to see the contact list. Mom was supposed to be at her book club tonight, probably at some restaurant downtown, laughing with her friends over wine and whatever novel they'd picked this month. The call failed immediately. No signal. I moved closer to the stairs, holding the phone up toward the ceiling, trying to find even one bar of service. Dad's voice boomed overhead again, that same furious shouting, but now there was something else underneath it, something that made my skin crawl. "Please work," I whispered to the phone, hitting redial. Failed again. Another crash from upstairs, followed by what sounded like breaking glass. Dad was really tearing the place apart now. Mom was going to lose her mind when she saw the damage, but first I had to get her home. I had to warn her about whatever was happening to him. I tried the call 3 more times before it finally connected. The phone rang twice before Mom's voice came through, bright and cheerful. "Hey, sweetheart, what's up?" The normalcy of her tone almost made me cry. In the background, I could hear the chatter of her friends, the clink of glasses, soft restaurant music. She sounded so relaxed, so completely unaware of what was happening here. "Mom, you need to come home. Right now." "What? Madison, what's wrong? You sound—" "Just listen to me, okay?" My voice was shaking, and I could hear it getting higher with panic. There was this weird emergency alert on TV, and then the power went out. Dad made me go to the basement, and now he's... A sound from upstairs cut me off. It wasn't shouting this time. It was lower, deeper, like a growl mixed with human speech. The kind of sound that shouldn't come from a person's throat. Madison? Honey, I can barely hear you. Did you say the power went out? Yes, the whole neighborhood. But Mom, that's not the important part. Dad is acting really strange. He's been shouting at someone who isn't there, and he's... Another crash, louder than before. Something heavy hit the floor directly above me, and I felt the shaking through the ceiling beams. Then came that growling sound again, followed by a series of thuds that sounded like someone was slamming their whole body against the walls. Madison, what was that noise? That's Dad! The words came out as a sob. Mom, please just come home. Something's wrong with him. Really wrong. I could hear her moving, probably getting away from her friends to hear better. Okay, slow down. What do you mean something's wrong with Dad? Is he hurt? I don't know. He told me to go to the basement while he checked the locks, but then he started yelling at someone, only there's no one else here. And now he's making these sounds that don't sound like him at all. The growling overhead got louder, more sustained. It went on for nearly 10 seconds without pause, like some kind of animal communication. But underneath it, I could still hear traces of Dad's voice, as if something was trying to speak through him. Jesus, Mom whispered. Madison, are you safe? Are you still in the basement? Yes, but Mom, you need to get here now. I'm scared. I'm leaving right now. I'm walking to my car. Just stay where you are, okay? Don't go upstairs. The relief that flooded through me was so strong my knees almost buckled. Okay, hurry. I will. I'm maybe 20 minutes away. Can you stay on the phone with me? I wanted to say yes, but the battery icon showed I only had about 15% left. I should save the battery in case we need to call for help. All right, but Madison, if anything changes, if you feel unsafe at all, you call 911 immediately. Do you understand? I understand. I love you. I'm coming. The line went dead, and I was alone again with the sounds from above. Only now they were getting worse. The shouting had stopped completely. What I heard instead was a series of low, rumbling noises that made my teeth ache. They weren't words anymore, weren't even attempts at words. They were guttural and wet, like sounds made by something with a throat full of liquid. Then came the breaking glass. Not just one piece, but what sounded like everything breakable in our living room hitting the floor at once. Picture frames, vases, the collection of glass birds Mom kept on the mantel, all of it crashing down at the same time. I backed away from the stairs. The flashlight beam shook along with my hands, making shadows move across the basement walls that made everything look strange and scary. The thumping sounds were getting more violent. Whatever Dad was doing up there, he was throwing his whole body against things. I could hear furniture being overturned, the scrape of wood against hardwood floors, the crash of something heavy falling over. And through it all, those sounds kept coming from his throat. They were getting deeper, longer, less human with each passing minute. I tried to tell myself it was still Dad, that he was just having some kind of breakdown, but the sounds were wrong in a way that made me want to run. I started moving backward toward the basement door without thinking. I grabbed the doorknob behind me and quietly turned the lock. The click seemed loud in the basement, quiet, but the noise upstairs was too loud for him to hear anything down here. As soon as I locked it, I suddenly realized what I'd done. I had just locked myself in the basement. Whatever was happening to Dad upstairs, whatever he was becoming, I was now trapped down here with no way out except through him. The sounds overhead continued, a mixture of destruction and those horrible noises that barely sounded human anymore. I pressed my back against the locked door and realized with growing fear that the person who had sent me down here for safety might no longer be a person at all. The car door slam cut through the basement, silence like a gunshot, and I nearly dropped the flashlight. Mom was home. Robert! Her voice carried through the house, echoing off the walls in a way that made my chest tighten. She sounded so normal, so completely unaware of what she was walking into. Rob, are you okay? The whole street's dark. I jumped off the couch and pressed myself against the basement door, trying to hear everything. Mom's footsteps went across the floor above me, careful, but with purpose. She was moving through the dark, probably using her phone's flashlight like I was doing down here. Jesus Christ, what happened in here? Mom's voice was closer now, maybe near the front door. Rob, where are you? Then I heard it. Dad's voice responding from somewhere toward the back of the house, but it wasn't his voice anymore. The sound that came out was so deep and distorted it barely qualified as speech. The words were there, but they sounded wrong, like they were coming from something inhuman. Sarah, you're home. Each word was dragged out, warped, like audio being played through water. I felt every hair on my arms stand up. That thing upstairs might look like my father, but whatever was speaking wasn't him. Mom, I shouted through the locked door, my voice cracking with panic. Mom, don't go near him. Something's wrong. Get out of the house. Madison, Mom called down, confusion clear in her voice. Honey, what are you doing down there? Why is the door locked? I pressed my ear against the wood, trying to hear if she was moving away from Dad or toward him. Her footsteps had stopped, and I could picture her standing in our destroyed living room, trying to make sense of what she was seeing and hearing. Please listen to me, I called up again. That's not Dad. Don't trust him. Just get out. What do you mean that's not? Mom started, but another sound from Dad cut her off. It wasn't words this time. It was something between a growl and a sigh, drawn out for several seconds. The kind of sound an animal might make when it's deciding whether to attack or retreat. But there were still traces of human vocal patterns underneath it, like Dad's voice was being used as an instrument by something that didn't know how to play it properly. Rob? Mom's voice was smaller now, uncertain. Are you feeling okay? Do you need me to call someone? Another growl in response, longer and lower than before. I could hear Mom's footsteps backing away, finally understanding that something was seriously wrong. Her shoes scraped against debris on the floor as she moved. Honey, I'm going to call for help, okay? Mom's voice was getting farther from wherever Dad was positioned. Just stay where you are. The thing that used to be Dad made a sound that could have been laughter if it came from a human, but this was wet and harsh, like someone choking on water while trying to talk. I couldn't make out a single word in the noise. Robert, please, Mom said, and I could hear her voice shaking now. Talk to me. Tell me what's wrong. More of those guttural sounds, coming in short bursts now. They had rhythm to them, almost like Dad was trying to communicate something specific, but the sounds themselves were so distorted they might as well have been coming from an animal. There were no consonants anymore, no clear vowels, just wet, deep vocalizations that made my stomach turn. Mom's footsteps were moving faster now, heading in my direction. I could hear her breathing hard, probably fighting the same terror that I'd been feeling for the past hour. Whatever she'd seen or heard up there had finally convinced her that something was deeply wrong. Madison, unlock the door, Mom called down, her footsteps quick on the basement stairs. Right now! I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. It took 3 tries before it finally clicked open. Mom reached the bottom of the stairs just as I got the door unlocked, both of us breathing hard in the flashlight's bright light. Her face was pale, her hair messy from moving through the dark house. But what scared me most was the look in her eyes. The same terror I'd been feeling, knowing that whatever was upstairs wasn't the person we loved anymore. Mom's eyes were wide and desperate as she reached the bottom of the stairs, her phone's flashlight beam shaking in her trembling hand. She grabbed my arm with her free hand, her fingers digging in hard enough to hurt. We have to get out of here, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Right now. The way she said it made my blood run cold. Whatever she'd seen or heard upstairs had shattered her usual optimism completely. Her face was ghost white in the harsh light, and I could see her jaw muscles working as she fought to stay calm. Another one of those guttural sounds came down from above, longer and more distorted than before. It kept going, getting louder, then softer in a creepy way. Mom flinched at the sound, her grip on my arm tightening. "Is that really Dad?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Mom's expression crumpled for just a second before she forced it back into determination. "I don't know what that is, but we're not staying to find out." She started back up the stairs, going slow and careful, testing each step before putting her full weight down. I followed close behind, both our phone lights pointed ahead. The wooden steps seemed louder than usual in the silence, every small creak making us both freeze. At the top of the stairs, Mom pressed her ear against the basement door and listened. The sounds from the back of the house had gotten quieter, but they were still there. Low, rumbling noises that made my skin crawl. They weren't coming from the living room anymore, though. They were farther away, maybe in the master bedroom or bathroom. Mom turned the door handle slowly, and we stepped into the kitchen together. The destruction was even worse than I'd imagined from the sounds alone. Our breakfast dishes were scattered across the floor in pieces, the refrigerator door hung open, and every drawer had been pulled out and overturned. Food from the pantry was scattered everywhere, cans and boxes trampled and torn open. We stayed pressed against the wall, moving toward the front of the house like we were sneaking past something dangerous. Mom kept her light pointed down so it wouldn't attract attention, and I did the same. The beam caught familiar objects. Mom's reading glasses crushed under what used to be our kitchen table. Dad's coffee mug shattered near the sink. The sounds from the back of the house changed again, getting closer. Heavy footsteps, but wrong somehow. Too forceful, like something much heavier than Dad was walking around back there. Each step was followed by a scraping sound, as if whatever was making them was dragging something across the floor. Mom reached the kitchen counter and grabbed her car keys with shaking hands. The metal jingled softly and we both froze, listening to see if the sound had drawn attention. The footsteps paused for a moment, then resumed, still moving in our general direction. I spotted my phone charger plugged into the wall outlet and grabbed it, stuffing it into my sweatshirt pocket along with my wallet from the counter. The $20 inside wasn't much, but it was something. Mom was already moving toward the front door, stepping carefully around the debris from Dad's rampage. The living room was completely destroyed. Our couch was flipped over, coffee table smashed to pieces, and every picture frame that had hung on the walls was scattered across the floor with broken glass everywhere. Deep gouges marked the wallpaper in several places, too big and too deep to have been made by fingernails. They looked more like claw marks. We reached the front door just as the sounds from the back of the house got much louder. Whatever Dad had become was moving toward us fast, those heavy footsteps picking up speed. The wet growling sounds turned into something that might have been excitement or hunger, rapid and sloppy that made me want to run away as fast as possible. Mom fumbled with the deadbolt, her hand shaking so badly she could barely grip the lock. Behind us, something slammed into a wall hard enough to make the whole house shake. Picture frames that had somehow survived the earlier destruction fell from their hooks and crashed to the floor. Come on," Mom muttered, finally getting the lock turned. The basement door burst open behind us with a bang that made us both jump. Something strong had thrown itself against the wood, and now it was slamming into it again and again, making the door shake like it was going to break off the hinges. Each hit was followed by one of those horrible sounds, part growl, part scream, part something I couldn't identify. Go. Mom yanked the front door open and shoved me through. We ran across the dark yard, stumbling over lawn ornaments and garden hoses we couldn't see. Mom's car was parked in the driveway, and she clicked the unlock button while we were still 20 feet away. The headlights flashed once, and the interior light came on, looking impossibly bright after so much darkness. I threw myself into the passenger seat while Mom started the engine. She backed out of the driveway so fast the tires squealed, and we sped down our street without looking back. My hands were shaking as I buckled my seatbelt, and I kept checking the side mirror to see if anything was following us. We drove in silence for several blocks, both of us breathing hard. Mom gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white, and she kept looking in the rearview mirror. When we reached the traffic light at Maple and 3rd, she finally slowed down, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The entire neighborhood was completely dark. Not just our street, but every street we could see from the intersection. No street lights, no porch lights, no blue light from TV screens and windows. Every house looked empty, like no one had lived in them for years. There were no other cars on the road, no people walking around, nobody checking on the power outage or talking to neighbors about what was happening. It was like the whole area had been evacuated while we were trapped in our house. "Mom," I said quietly, "where is everyone?" She followed my stare, looking around the empty streets around us. Her expression changed from relief to a new kind of worry as she noticed what I was seeing, or what I wasn't seeing. "I don't know," she said, her voice hollow. The silence outside the car was complete. No dogs barking, no air conditioners running, no distant sound of traffic from the highway. Even the usual chorus of crickets and night insects was completely absent, like the power outage had somehow shut off all life in the area along with the electricity. The traffic light above us wasn't working either, just a dark metal fixture hanging over an empty intersection. Mom looked both ways twice before driving through, and I found myself checking too, though there was clearly nothing coming. "Dorothy and Harold," Mom said suddenly, like she'd just remembered they existed. "We'll go to Dorothy and Harold's. They live across town. Maybe whatever this is didn't reach them." She turned left and drove faster, taking us out of our neighborhood and toward the main highway. As we left the dark zone behind, I pressed my face against the window and watched our neighborhood disappear into the blackness. Everything behind us looked dead and empty, like we'd just escaped from some kind of disaster area. 20 minutes later, we pulled into the Wilsons' driveway, and I nearly cried with relief. Their porch light was on, warm, yellow light spilling across their front yard. More lights were on in their windows, and I could see Harold's truck parked where it always was, right next to Dorothy's little blue sedan. Everything looked normal, safe, like the world hadn't just turned upside down. Mom turned off the engine and we sat there for a moment, both of us staring at the house like we couldn't quite believe it was real. After everything we'd just been through, the simple sight of lights in windows felt like a miracle. "Come on," Mom said, her voice stronger now. "Let's go inside." We walked up the path we'd been to many times before to their front door, and I felt the tension in my shoulders start to release for the first time since that emergency alert had come on our television. Whatever had happened to Dad, whatever had made our neighborhood go dark and empty, it hadn't reached here. We were safe. Dorothy opened the front door before we even reached it, her face etched with concern as she took in our disheveled appearance. Harold appeared behind her, his reading glasses perched on top of his head, and I could see the worry in both their expressions as they ushered us inside. "Sarah, what on earth happened?" Dorothy asked, her hands already reaching for Mom's shoulders. "You both look like you've seen a ghost." Mom's composure finally cracked as Dorothy's arms wrapped around her. The tears she'd been holding back since we ran away from our house came pouring out, and she collapsed against her friend like she couldn't stand anymore. Harold guided us into their living room, where their cozy home felt so different from the scary situation we'd just escaped. "I need to call the police," Mom managed between sobs, pulling her phone from her pocket with shaking hands. "Something's wrong with Robert. Really wrong." Dorothy and Harold gave each other a look that made my stomach tighten. The idea that something could be seriously wrong with Dad clearly shook them both. Mom called 911, and I watched her struggle to find the right words when the dispatcher answered. "How do you explain that your husband turned into something that makes sounds no human throat should be able to produce? How do you describe the way his voice had stretched and twisted until it barely qualified as speech?" "I need to report a domestic disturbance," Mom said finally, her voice steadying as she fell into a more clinical tone. My husband is having some kind of mental health crisis. He became violent and destroyed our house. We had to leave for our safety. I listened to her reduce what we'd experienced to terms the police could understand. Mental health crisis, violent episode, property damage, all technically true, but missing the horror of what Dad had become. I understood why she was doing it, who would believe the real story, but it felt like a betrayal of what we'd witnessed. The dispatcher asked questions, and Mom provided our address, Dad's description, and a summary of events that made everything sound like a typical domestic violence situation. She was careful not to mention the emergency alert, the power outage, or the weird sounds. Just a husband who'd snapped and a family who'd run away. When she hung up, Harold was already putting on his jacket. I'm coming with you, he said firmly. Whatever's going on, you shouldn't face it alone. Dorothy nodded her agreement, already heading toward the kitchen. I'll make coffee and sandwiches for when you get back. You both need to eat something. 2 police cars pulled into the driveway 20 minutes later, their red and blue lights flashing in the dark but making no sound. I watched through the window as 4 officers got out. They had no idea what they were walking into. Officer Martinez took the lead. She had gray hair and a tight bun. Her partner, Officer Chen, looked younger and kept checking his notepad as Mom explained the situation again. They listened patiently, asking the same questions the dispatcher had, but I could see they didn't really believe her. Has your husband ever exhibited violent behavior before? Officer Martinez asked, her pen poised over her own notepad. Never, Mom replied firmly. This was completely out of character. That's why I'm so worried about him. Any history of mental illness, depression, anxiety, substance abuse? Nothing. He's always been the steady one in our family. This came out of nowhere. Officer Chen looked up from his notes. You said he was shouting at someone who wasn't there? Mom hesitated, glancing at me before answering. It seemed that way, yes. But Madison was in the basement the whole time, so maybe I was mistaken about what I heard. I wanted to speak up, to tell them about the sounds that weren't words, about the way Dad's voice had changed into something impossible. But Mom's warning look stopped me. She was trying to keep this contained, to present a version of events that wouldn't get us both committed for psychiatric evaluation. Officer Martinez closed her notepad. We'll need to check on your husband's welfare. Can you take us to the house? The drive back felt surreal. Harold followed behind the police cars in his truck, and I found myself gripping the door handle as we approached our neighborhood. The streetlights were working again, the houses showing signs of life, televisions flashing behind curtains, porch lights illuminating front yards. Everything looked normal, like the dead zone we'd escaped from had never existed. Our house sat dark and silent at the end of the street. The front door stood slightly open, exactly as we'd left it when we ran. Officer Martinez called out as we approached the porch, her hand resting on her weapon. Police! Robert Miller! We're here to check on your welfare. No response came from inside. She called out twice more before pushing the door open wider and stepping into the entryway, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Officer Chen followed, and Mom and I stayed close behind with Harold bringing up the rear. The destruction was even worse than I remembered. Every piece of furniture in the living room had been overturned or smashed. Our coffee table lay in splinters near the front window, and the couch cushions were scattered across the floor with long tears in the fabric. But what made both officers stop and stare were the walls. Deep gouges ran along the hallway and into the living room, scraped into the drywall at shoulder height. They were too wide and too deep to have been made by fingernails, and they followed no pattern a human hand could make. The marks looked like something with claws had raked along the walls while moving through the house. Jesus, Officer Chen muttered under his breath. What the hell did this? Officer Martinez was already heading toward the back of the house, calling Dad's name and looking through each room carefully. We followed her through the kitchen, where every cabinet door hung open and dishes covered the floor in ceramic shards. The refrigerator had been knocked over, and there were more of those claw marks scratched into the kitchen island. No sign of forced entry, Officer Martinez reported as she checked the back door. Locks are still engaged from the inside. They searched the master bedroom, bathroom, and even the closets, but found nothing. Dad had simply disappeared, leaving behind only the destruction and those impossible scratch marks. When Officer Chen tested the television, it worked perfectly. No emergency alert, no static, just normal programming. We met up in the living room where Officer Martinez took photos of the damage while Officer Chen questioned us again. This time his tone was different, less routine, more confused. "Mrs. Miller, I have to ask, are you certain your husband did all this damage himself?" Mom looked around at the destruction, her face pale in the harsh beam of the officer's flashlight. "Who else could have done it? We were the only ones here." "These marks on the walls..." Officer Chen aimed his light at the gouges near the hallway entrance. "I've never seen anything like them. What could make scratches that deep?" "I don't know," Mom replied. And for once, she wasn't hiding the truth. She really didn't know. Officer Martinez finished her photographs and holstered her camera. "We'll file a missing person report and put out a BOLO alert for your husband. But I have to be honest with you. This doesn't fit the pattern of any domestic violence case I've worked. The damage, these marks, the way he just disappeared without a trace." She trailed off, clearly struggling to categorize what she was seeing. Harold stepped forward, his expression grim as he examined the claw marks himself. "Maybe he had some kind of psychotic break," he suggested. "People can do incredible damage when they're not in their right mind." But even as he said it, I could tell he didn't believe it. None of us did. The marks on the walls weren't random destruction. They were too careful, too planned out, like something had been marking territory or leaving a message we couldn't understand. Officer Martinez handed Mom a case number and promised they'd patrol the area, but her tone showed she was just as confused as the rest of us. After they left, Harold helped us grab some clothes and personal stuff while Mom stood in the doorway, looking at what used to be our home. "He's really gone," she said quietly, her voice hollow with the realization that this wasn't something that could be fixed or explained away. I looked around at the destruction one last time before we left, and all I could think about were those sounds Dad had made. The growling, the wet noises that barely sounded human. Whatever had torn through our house that night, whatever had left those claw marks on the walls, it hadn't been my father. But I couldn't tell the police that. I couldn't even tell Mom. So I followed her back to the car, carrying the terrible knowledge that some disappearances can't be solved because the truth is too impossible to believe. The search parties started 3 days after we filed the missing person report. Mom organized the first one herself, printing flyers at the local copy shop and posting them on every telephone pole and storefront window within a 10-mile radius of our house. Dad's face stared back at us from every corner, the same professional headshot from his work ID, before whatever had taken his place that night. I watched Mom tape another flyer to the window of Murphy's Hardware. She was quick about it. She'd put all her energy into this, like finding Dad was just another project that needed good planning and enough volunteers. "The more people who see his picture, the better our chances," she said for the third time that morning, smoothing down the tape with more force than necessary. "Someone has to have seen him." Mom had called Dad's office the morning after the police visit. She spent 20 minutes on the phone with his supervisor, explaining that he'd had some kind of medical emergency and wouldn't be in for a while. I could hear the confusion in the supervisor's voice through the receiver. Dad had never missed a day of work in 8 years, never even called in sick. His co-workers hadn't heard from him either. Neither had his poker buddies from Thursday nights, or his brother in Denver, or his elderly uncle in Florida. Mom worked through Dad's entire contact list, her voice getting higher and more strained with each conversation that yielded nothing. "He has to be somewhere," she kept saying. as if repeating it enough times would make it true. People don't just vanish. But I knew better. I'd heard what Dad had become before he disappeared, and that thing couldn't just walk into a grocery store or check into a motel. Whatever had happened to him went beyond a missing person case, beyond anything the police were equipped to handle. The house felt wrong now, even with the new security measures Mom had insisted on. The locksmith came the day after our police visit, installing deadbolts on every door and window locks that required keys from the inside. A security company followed 2 days later, mounting cameras at every entrance and corner of the property. The technician explained the monitoring system to Mom while I watched him test each camera feed on his tablet. "Motion-activated recording," he said, adjusting the angle on the back porch camera. "Any movement in the detection zone triggers immediate recording and sends an alert to your phone." Mom nodded like this would solve everything, but I could see the tension in her shoulders as she signed the paperwork. The cameras were supposed to make us feel safer, but they just reminded me that we were expecting something to come back. I started checking the locks every night before bed. Not just once, but 3 or 4 times, testing each deadbolt and window latch until my fingers were sore from turning metal. The new locks were stiff and hard to operate, requiring more force than our old ones, but I preferred knowing they were secure. Mom caught me doing it on the 4th night, standing in the hallway in my pajamas as I worked my way through the house for the 2nd time. "Honey, you already checked those," she said gently, but I could hear the worry in her voice. "I know. I just want to make sure." She watched me test the front door deadbolt again, the metal clicking firmly into place. "The security system will alert us if anyone tries to get in." I wanted to tell her that the security system was designed for human intruders, for people who would trip motion sensors and set off alarms. What we'd encountered that night might not trigger normal detection methods, but Mom was barely holding herself together as it was, and I couldn't add to her burden with my fears about supernatural threats. The volunteer search parties grew larger each weekend. Mom recruited people from her book club, Dad's work, our neighbors. They divided into teams and searched through the woods behind our neighborhood, the hiking trails along Miller Creek, the abandoned buildings on the outskirts of town. I joined the searches every Saturday, walking through overgrown fields and calling Dad's name even though I knew he wouldn't answer. Not as himself anyway. But participating made Mom feel better, and it was easier than explaining why I thought we were wasting our time. The volunteers were kind and dedicated. Mrs. Chen brought sandwiches for the search teams. Harold organized the grid patterns and marked off areas we'd already covered. Dorothy coordinated with local businesses to post flyers and spread the word. But every search ended the same way, empty-handed, with Mom's smile getting a little more forced each time we regrouped at the parking lot. Officer Martinez called every few days with updates that weren't really updates. No new leads, no sightings, no evidence of foul play. Dad's credit cards hadn't been used. His bank account remained untouched. His cell phone went straight to voicemail. It was like he'd disappeared the moment we ran away from our house that night. These cases can take time, Officer Martinez assured Mom during one of their phone calls. Sometimes people need space to work through personal issues. He might contact you when he's ready. I could see Mom's frustration growing with each conversation. The police were treating this like a standard missing person case, a middle-aged man who'd had a breakdown and wandered off to clear his head. They couldn't understand that Dad hadn't left voluntarily, that whatever had taken his place that night wasn't capable of making rational decisions about personal space or working through issues. My online research didn't find anything useful. I looked for cases of people making inhuman sounds, of mysterious disappearances following emergency alerts, of voice distortion and violent behavior changes. The results were either science fiction stories or medical articles about throat cancer and vocal cord damage. Nothing that matched what we'd experienced. I tried searching for emergency broadcast interruptions, power outages coinciding with disappearances, even reports of scratches on walls that couldn't be explained. But every search led to dead ends or conspiracy theory websites that mixed genuine mysteries with obvious fiction. The neighborhood had returned to normal within 24 hours of Dad's disappearance. The power came back on the next morning like nothing had ever happened. People emerged from their houses, went to work, walked their dogs, mowed their lawns. The emergency alert was never mentioned on the news, never explained or followed up on. It was like the entire incident had been erased from official memory. I asked our neighbor, Mr. Patterson, if he'd heard the alert that night, if he'd noticed the power outage or seen anything unusual. He looked at me with genuine confusion and said he'd slept through the whole night without any problems. No alert, no power issues, no strange sounds from our house. Mrs. Rodriguez across the street had the same reaction. So did the Johnsons 2 houses down. Either the entire neighborhood was lying, or the alert had been specifically targeted at our house. Both possibilities made me feel sick. Mom was still trying to stay positive, but it wasn't working so well anymore. I caught her staring at Dad's empty chair during dinner, her fork halfway to her mouth, lost in thought. She'd started talking to his photo on the mantelpiece when she thought I wasn't around, updating him on the search efforts and promising to keep looking until she found him. But late at night, when she thought I was asleep, I could hear her crying in their bedroom. Quiet, muffled sobs that she buried in her pillow so I wouldn't hear. The forced cheer during the day was taking its toll, and I wondered how much longer she could maintain the pretense that everything would work out fine. 3 weeks after Dad's disappearance, I was lying in bed listening to the security system's quiet noise when I heard Mom get up and walk to the kitchen. The soft sound of the refrigerator opening reached my room, followed by the quiet clink of a glass being set on the counter. I got up and found her standing at the kitchen window, looking out at our backyard in the darkness. She was holding a glass of water but not drinking it, just staring at the spot where Dad used to grill burgers every Sunday during the summer. "Can't sleep either?" I asked, softly. She turned toward me, and in the dim light from the security camera's infrared glow, I could see how exhausted she looked. The bags under her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged when she thought no one was watching. "I keep thinking I'll hear his key in the lock," she admitted. "Every sound the house makes, every car that drives by. I think it might be him coming home." I wanted to tell her that if Dad did come home, it wouldn't be him anymore. That the thing wearing his face that night had been something else entirely. Something that couldn't be helped or reasoned with or brought back to normal. But she needed hope right now, even if it was false hope. So I stood next to her at the window, both of us looking out at the empty yard, both of us listening for sounds that would never come. 2 weeks had passed since Dad disappeared, and I'd stopped pretending he was coming back. Mom hadn't reached that point yet. She was getting dressed for another support group meeting, standing in front of Dorothy's guest room mirror as she put on lipstick, with hands that still shook a little. The support group was her latest attempt at finding answers, or at least finding people who understood what it meant to have someone disappear without explanation. "You sure you don't want to come with me tonight?" she asked, capping the lipstick and dropping it into her purse. "Dr. Patterson says family sessions can be really helpful." I shook my head from where I sat on the edge of the bed, watching her go through the motions of hope. "I'm good." What I didn't say was that Dr. Patterson and the support group were designed for normal disappearances. Husbands who walked out after arguments, teenagers who ran away from home, elderly people with dementia who wandered off and got lost. They weren't equipped to handle whatever had taken my father's place that night. Mom kissed my forehead before she left, her lips cool against my skin. "Dorothy's making dinner. Try to eat something, okay?" After she was gone, I lay back on the narrow guest bed and looked at the ceiling. The room still smelled like the lavender sachets Dorothy kept in all her drawers, mixed with the faint smell of unfamiliar detergent from sheets that weren't ours. Everything here was kind and welcoming, but none of it felt like home. Home was a house with claw marks scraped into the walls and a living room completely destroyed. Home was where something wearing my father's face had made sounds no human throat should produce, where the emergency alert had played with that distorted voice that got worse with each repetition. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice memo app, something I'd been doing every few days since we left the house. The recording was only 37 seconds long, captured during those first terrifying minutes, when Dad had started shouting at invisible enemies upstairs. I pressed play and held the phone close to my ear, listening to the background noise from that night. My own breathing, quick and panicked. The sound of my footsteps on the basement stairs. And underneath it all, muffled but audible, the horrible sounds that had come from somewhere above. The sounds were worse when I played them back, more obviously wrong than they'd seemed in the moment. Whatever had been speaking through Dad's vocal cords hadn't understood how human speech was supposed to work. The rhythm was off, the tone stretched in ways that made my skin crawl. I'd played this recording dozens of times, partly to convince myself I hadn't imagined it, and partly to prepare myself for hearing it again. Because deep down, I knew that whatever had taken Dad wasn't finished with us. Mom thought I was being paranoid when I checked the locks at Dorothy's house every night, when I insisted on keeping the curtains closed after dark, when I jumped at unexpected sounds. She blamed it on trauma, on the shock of witnessing Dad's breakdown. Dr. Patterson would probably agree if Mom ever convinced me to attend one of those sessions, but they didn't understand that trauma was just the beginning. I wasn't recovering from something that had already ended. I was preparing for something that might happen again. The official investigation had been quietly closed 3 days ago. Officer Martinez called Mom with the news, explaining that they'd exhausted all leads and had no evidence of foul play. Dad's case would remain open, technically, but they weren't actively pursuing it anymore. Sometimes people just need to disappear for a while, Officer Martinez had said, her voice gentle but firm. He's an adult, and there's no indication he was taken against his will. No indication, except for the destroyed house, the impossible claw marks, and the sounds that still woke me up in cold sweats. But none of that fit into their official report, so it got filed away as property damage from a domestic disturbance. I heard Dorothy moving around in the kitchen downstairs, probably starting dinner preparation like she did every evening at 5:30. The routine was nice and predictable. Dorothy cooking, Harold reading his newspaper in the living room, the quiet noise of a normal household. But even here, feeling safe and normal, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not by the police or concerned neighbors, but by something else. Something that knew where we were and was waiting to make contact again. I'd started paying attention to details that other people missed. The way shadows looked different in the evening, how certain sounds carried further than they should, the occasional flash of movement at the edge of my vision that disappeared when I looked directly. Last week I'd noticed a dog barking in the middle of the night, a sharp, desperate sound that went on for nearly 10 minutes before stopping suddenly. Harold said it was probably just a raccoon in someone's garbage, but the timing felt wrong. Dogs barked at intruders, at threats, at things that didn't belong in their territory. Mom was attending her support group meetings twice a week now, each session reinforcing her belief that Dad would eventually come home. She'd started talking about when he returned instead of if, planning how we'd rebuild our relationship and work through whatever crisis had driven him away. I wanted to tell her that the man who'd sent me to the basement that night had already known he wasn't coming back. The way he'd insisted I go downstairs, the urgency in his voice. Those were the actions of someone saying goodbye. The real Dad had been trying to protect me from what he was becoming. Whatever had taken control of him afterward was something else entirely, something that had torn through our house with inhuman strength and left marks that no person could make. But Mom needed her hope, needed to believe that love and persistence could bring Dad home. I couldn't take that away from her, even though I knew she was searching for someone who no longer existed. Dorothy called up the stairs that dinner was ready, her voice warm and motherly in a way that made my chest tight. She'd been taking care of us without complaint, treating us like family instead of house guests who'd stayed too long. Harold had cleared out his home office so I'd have a place to do homework, and they'd both pretended not to notice when I woke up screaming from nightmares. I went downstairs and found them setting the table with their good china, the same pattern they'd used for Sunday dinners since I was little. Harold was carving a pot roast, and Dorothy was putting vegetables from serving dishes to our plates. "Your mother should be back by 8, Dorothy said, spooning mashed potatoes next to my slice of roast. She said the group was discussing coping strategies tonight. Harold nodded and passed me the gravy boat. Good for her to have people who understand what she's going through. I wanted to tell them that nobody understood what Mom was going through, because nobody else had watched their spouse turn into something that shouldn't exist. But Dorothy and Harold were trying so hard to make everything feel normal that I couldn't bring myself to ruin their careful optimism. We ate in comfortable silence, the kind of peaceful family dinner I remembered from before everything changed. But even with all the warmth and safety, I kept listening for weird sounds, checking the windows for anything moving in the dark outside, because I knew that whatever had taken Dad was still out there somewhere. And questions like that don't just go away. They stick around and get worse until they're ready to force answers that no one wants to give. Some things can't be explained by support groups or therapy sessions or official investigations. Some disappearances leave gaps that never get fixed, and some families never recover from finding out what's really possible when the normal rules stop working. I'd learned to live with that uncertainty, but I'd never stopped preparing for the moment when it would find us again.